who had shifted to support the next step, provided the UN inspection system was improved by its being placed near the center of the Sinai. Sadat volunteered another incentive, proposing that warning stations in the Sinai be manned by Americans, and instructing his foreign minister, "This is an important proposal. Americans would be witnesses. It would be a complete guarantee for the Israelis." An agreement emerged on September 1, 1975. It did not produce the elation of the first disengagement agreement, but it was substantively more significant. Egypt and Israel were balancing military necessities against political conditions. Both sides declared that, on defined issues, force would not be used. Israel gave up the passes. Egypt renounced the use of force against Israel in a range of circumstances, even pledging not to support Syria in another attack on Israel. These measures would define Israel's and Egypt's entire perceptions of one another. Sadat and Rabin were reaching for a comprehensive solution, not for the entire region but in essence with each other. Both sides' options were narrowed by their achievements, in Sadat's case by his increasing movement to the edge of what his people could understand or bear, and in Rabin's case by his own gradual movement toward a new definition of peace that was no longer a matter of pieces of land. Sadat's journey to Jerusalem. Both Israel and Egypt understood that little space was left for another interim agreement in the Sinai. But in late 1976, with an American election imminent, they began to explore another step, which would have been to draw a line from El Arish to Ras Mohammed within 20 miles of Israel's border, indeed, to the same Kissinger line that Sadat had proposed in our first meeting almost 3 years earlier. Had Ford won the election, the El Arish-Ras Mohammed line, in return for an end of belligerency, would have been his first foreign policy move after inauguration. Through the last year of the Ford administration and the first year of Jimmy Carter's, Sadat tried to keep the United States engaged in his vision of a wider peace. In August 1976, he told U.S. Ambassador Hermann Eilts that he hoped a new American proposal would come soon, and if it did not, he would encourage the Israelis to put all cards on the table. During the 1976 election campaign, the Carter team had committed itself to an overall agreement between Israel and all of its Arab neighbors, to be achieved at a conference of all the parties, with the future of Palestine as a key subject. President Carter's inauguration in January 1977 thus put an end to the step-by-step process, as an American strategy. On April 3, 1977, believing that the Americans hold more than 99% of the cards in the game, Sadat presented a plan for peace to the newly inaugurated President Carter. In reiterating the need for a Palestinian state and for Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 borders, Sadat said he was also prepared formally to recognize Israel and would not object to U.S. aid or guarantees to the prospective Palestinian state. Nothing could have been further from Sadat's mind, or the Israelis, than a multilateral Middle East conference, let alone an attempt at a comprehensive settlement. For one thing, any such gathering would invite proposals for returning to the pre-state frontiers of 1947, which no political party in Israel accepted, at least where the West Bank was concerned. The 1947 partition plan called for a line on the West Bank within 10 miles of the road between Israel's two principal cities of Tel Aviv and Haifa, and even closer to Ben Gurion Airport, Israel's only international hub. For another, a multi-party conference would also resurrect the question of the PLO's presence, which Israel refused to consider, and the problematic issue of Soviet participation. Sadat continued to oppose a comprehensive conference because it would have reintroduced Soviet influence into the Middle East, given Syria a veto over Egypt's diplomacy and threatened his understanding of how peace might gradually be achieved. But President Carter was unconvinced by Sadat's April proposal and disturbed by the Egyptians' resistance to the comprehensive approach. To overcome Sadat's objections, on October 21, 1977, Carter appealed directly to him to support the conference. Afraid that the president might force him into a diplomacy in which hostile Soviets and suspicious Arab allies could block his efforts, Sadat leaped directly to ultimate goals. If a lasting rearrangement of the Egyptian-Israeli relationship was to be achieved, it would require another shock to the system. Sadat wrote later that Carter's advocacy for peace directed my thinking for the first time toward the initiative that I was to take. By way of a response to Carter's letter, Sadat's address at the opening of the new Egyptian parliament on November 9, 1977, sounded familiar cues of going to the ends of the earth for peace. This time, however, he included a brief mention of a hypothetical visit to Israel. Israel will be surprised when it hears me say that I won't refuse to go to their own home, to the Knesset itself, to discuss peace with them. Sadat buried the Knesset reference amidst positive mentions of Carter's proposed Geneva conference, which he did not dare to reject. For the sake of Yasser Arafat, the PLO leader who was sitting in the audience, he insisted that the negotiating parties at such a conference include Palestinian representatives, a requirement he knew the Israelis would not accept. Though the seriousness of his commitment to peace was plain, almost no one realized that he was actually floating the idea of a visit to Israel and had no intention of going to Geneva. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, however, picked up on Sadat's signal. Begin had replaced Rabin as prime minister in May 1977. Having emigrated from Poland in 1942, he had at first served as head of the Irgun, an underground paramilitary unit, and then 3 decades in political opposition. Begin was inflexible and legalistic in his view of negotiations. Yet he did not rule out a binding peace with Egypt as long as it did not include the pre-1967 frontiers. 153, on November 15, perhaps in good faith, or perhaps merely to place Sadat at a disadvantage in world opinion, Begin seized the initiative and formally invited the Egyptian president to Jerusalem. Just after dark on November 19, a Saturday, to respect the Sabbath, Sadat's plane landed in Israel to global astonishment. I had telephoned Sadat the day before to congratulate him on this latest daring peace initiative. I found him relaxed and at peace with himself. Which leading Israeli figure, he asked, did I think he would find most impressive? He himself thought it would probably be the dashing Ezer Weizman, Israel's former Air Force commander and now defense minister in Begin's government, and in his youth a member of the Irgun underground. I suggested Dayan as a possibility. We were both wrong. It turned out to be the old one, Golda Meir. She was among the Israeli leaders in the reception line at the airport. The atmosphere upon Sadat's arrival was tense. The Israelis half expected an ambush, while Sadat's security people feared for his safety. Radicals on either side might have used this dramatic moment to cut his effort short. But some events transcend ordinary calculations. The initial chill subsided as, to a fanfare of trumpets, wildly cheering Israelis welcomed the Egyptian president on a visit that nobody had previously dared to imagine. The morning after his arrival, a Sunday, Sadat prayed at Al-Aqsa Mosque and then visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial and Museum. Thereafter, his first official act was to address the Knesset. His very presence in that body posed a radical challenge to the historic Arab stand. The speech itself, in traditional classical Arabic, discarded the established rhetoric of entrenched enmity. It rested the achievement of peace not in the tactics of decades of recrimination but in the souls of the adversaries. Frankness makes it incumbent upon me to tell you the following. First, I have not come here for a separate agreement between Egypt and Israel. In the absence of a just solution of the Palestinian problem, never will there be that durable and just peace upon which the entire world insists. Second, I have not come to you to seek a partial peace, namely to terminate the state of belligerency at this stage and put off the entire problem to a subsequent stage. Equally, I have not come to you for a third disengagement agreement in Sinai or in Golan or the West Bank. For this would mean that we are merely delaying the ignition of the fuse. I have come to you so that together we shall build a durable peace based on justice to avoid the shedding of one single drop of blood, by both sides. It is for this reason that I have proclaimed my readiness to go to the farthest corner of the earth. Settling for any half measures, Sadat said, would mean that we are too weak to shoulder the burdens and responsibilities of a durable peace based upon justice. But he believed both parties were strong enough to make such a peace. In the emotional culmination of the speech, he asked, "Why don't we stretch out our hands with faith and sincerity so that, together, we might destroy this barrier?" Sadat defined peace not so much as a finalized set of conditions as above all a fragile, vulnerable state, to be amended and defended with all possible tenacity against the rebirth of conflict. Peace, Sadat proclaimed, is not a mere endorsement of written lines. Rather, it is a rewriting of history. Peace is a giant struggle against all and every ambition and whim. Begin responded with an address that rose above his usual legalistic approach to overcome the inertia of conflict, and embrace the full range of diplomatic options. President Sadat knows, and he knew from us before he came to Jerusalem, that our position concerning permanent borders between us and our neighbors differs from his. However, I call upon the President of Egypt and upon all our neighbors, do not rule out negotiations on any subject whatsoever. I propose, in the name of the overwhelming majority of the Parliament, that everything will be negotiable. Everything is negotiable. No side shall say the contrary. No side shall present prior conditions. We will conduct the negotiations with respect. Sadat's journey to Jerusalem was that rare occasion in which the mere fact of an event constitutes an interruption of history, and thereby transforms the range of the possible. It was his ultimate revolution, more consequential and truer to the spirit of his leadership than the coup of July 1952, the correction of April 1971, the July 1972 expulsion of the Soviets or the War of October 1973 and its aftermath. The visit marked the fulfillment of Sadat's particular kind of nationalism, which expressed peace as a form of inner liberation. The tortuous road to peace. The October War had cost Egypt more than 10,000 lives, including Sadat's youngest brother, a fighter pilot downed in a raid on an Israeli military airport. For Israel, the figures had been more than 2,600 killed and more than 7,000 wounded. Meeting at an Egyptian military hospital during one of the shuttles, Sadat told me how much his country had suffered from war and that it did not need to produce more martyrs. The next 4 years would demonstrate that Sadat had set too high an initial hurdle for both sides. The first recriminations would come from the Arab world. Prior to the visit to Jerusalem, the last meeting between an Arab head of state and a Zionist or Israeli leader had been when Emir Faisal met with Chaim Weizmann in January 1919. Since then, for wars had been fought on the very principles that Sadat proclaimed he was ready to abandon. Aside from the immediate stakes, Arab leaders felt personally betrayed by Sadat's failure to consult them. On a practical level, they worried that his presence in Jerusalem would strengthen the Israelis' negotiating position. Assad of Syria was outright contemptuous. When in 1975 I had asked him for his alternative, he replied, icily, "You are abandoning Vietnam. You will abandon Taiwan. And we will be here when you grow tired of Israel." Within Sadat's government, too, there was substantial opposition. On November 15, 1977, Foreign Minister Fahmy resigned in protest at the decision to visit Jerusalem. Pressure on Israel from America increased. When, on November 19, Begin called Carter to confirm Sadat's arrival in Jerusalem, Carter told him, "You must have observed Fahmy has resigned. There is the need for some tangible contribution for Sadat to take home. He has run high risks." Given this history, it is curious that in the aftermath of his visit, Sadat would sometimes be accused of going through Jerusalem to get to Washington. In fact, he sought to do just the reverse. In July 1977, Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, for whom Sadat had only contempt, had provoked a brief war with Egypt over Sadat's insistence on his pursuit of peace with Israel, and his rejection of Gaddafi's proposals of unity with Libya. He later described Sadat's actions as a betrayal of the Arab nation. Syria and the PLO expressed similar outrage in a joint communiqué. Sadat's visit, along with the Sadat Begin plan, has no other aim but to impose a fait accompli on the Arab nation and thereby invalidate all genuine efforts to achieve a just peace based upon total withdrawal from all the occupied Arab territories. A formal Sadat Begin plan was at this point only a fantasy. Nevertheless, at a conference in Tripoli in December 1977, Syria, Algeria, southern Yemen, Libya and the PLO described Sadat's actions as high treason. There they decided to apply punitive anti-Israel boycott laws to any Egyptian entities that traded with Israel. Shortly thereafter, Egypt severed its relations with 5 Arab states and the PLO. Sadat had hoped that the visit to Jerusalem would complement the exclusive relationship between Israel and America, and jolt negotiations for peace into a new phase, to produce a more robust and permanent agreement. He also anticipated that a divided Arab front would give Israel new opportunities for negotiating. But, over the next year, Begin and Sadat achieved only faltering steps toward peace. In December 1977, Begin reciprocated the Jerusalem visit by traveling to the Egyptian city of Ismailia, but the only product of the summit there was an arrangement for meetings of the two sides' military and political experts, which quickly ran into the ground. Begin, like Sadat, had started as a revolutionary. Unlike Sadat, he was the head of government in a country whose neighbors rejected its right to exist. He fought tenaciously on matters of symbol and language. In 1975, in response to the argument that Israel needed to give up territory in order to be recognized by its Arab neighbors, he shot back that the Israeli people don't need legitimacy. "We exist. Therefore, we are legitimate." Begin had an even deeper concern than recognition. More than his predecessors, he feared that Sadat would endanger the relationship with America that guaranteed Israel's existence. In March 1978, Sadat wrote to Begin in language recalling the formula Nixon had expressed to Hafiz Ismail in February 1973: "Security should not be at the expense of land or sovereignty." That principle, Sadat wrote, had already been recognized by Egypt with respect to the existence of Israel, and he would do his part to convince the Arabs and the international community of it. But Israel would have to act according to the same principle. With respect to the Palestinian Arabs, it could not raise the issues in terms of land and sovereignty, and with respect to Egypt, it could not request the sacrifice of land and sovereignty in exchange for peace. Sadat implied that security could be achieved as a stable equilibrium, an agreed-upon balance, sustained above all by overcoming established formulas and founded on a conception of justice that was rooted in the prospect of mutual benefit and the achievement of a shared vision of peace. The two sides failed to come together even after renewed American participation in the spring of 1978. Sadat's frustration grew, as did his separation from his colleagues, who felt that his commitment to peace had become too overriding. Exasperated, Sadat asked Carter to join the negotiating table. The president responded with invitations to both him and Begin for a meeting at Camp David in September 1978. At the outset of the talks, which lasted from September 5 to September 17, bilateral negotiations between the parties were still so fraught that Carter and Secretary of State Cyrus Vance had to mediate to get them started. Sadat had problems even within his own delegation. As he said to one foreign ministry official, "You people in the foreign ministry are under the impression that you understand politics. In reality, however, you understand absolutely nothing. Henceforth I shall not pay the least attention to either your words or your memos. I am a man whose actions are governed by a higher strategy which you are incapable of either perceiving or understanding." Not surprisingly, Fahmy's successor, Foreign Minister Kamel, also resigned, shortly before the conclusion of the Camp David Accords. From the moment he set foot in Jerusalem, Sadat had committed himself irrevocably to an Egyptian-Israeli peace. Over 12 days of negotiations, he substantially modified elements of the Standard Arab Program. 3 months before the October War, in 1973, Sadat had rejected American views on the opening of the Suez Canal abruptly. No partial solution, no separate solution with Egypt alone, no negotiations whatsoever. My initiative, for opening the Suez Canal, was not designed at all as a partial or a step-by-step solution, and was not an end in itself. What I said was, let me test your intentions regarding Israel's retreat, so that I be convinced that she would indeed complete her withdrawal. When the final date of evacuation is set, I would then clear the canal. But today, no. At Camp David 5 years later, Sadat agreed to a settlement that, while leaving the fulfillment of its moral spirit to the future, contained detailed steps to be taken immediately and others to be accomplished further down the road. Despite lingering differences, it was built on the trust gradually and mutually accumulated over the previous 4 years. Both sides agreed to renounce the use of force, to normalize relations, to sign a bilateral peace treaty and to allow the continued presence of UN forces around the Suez Canal. Israel agreed to withdraw from the entirety of the Sinai. The step-by-step approach had managed to attain nearly all that the advocates of the comprehensive approach had set out to accomplish in one major conference. At the same time, Egypt's national objectives had been brought about by Sadat's strategy and, beyond that, the definition of principles for regional peace and equilibrium. Israel reached the permanent binding agreement with one neighbor that it had sought with all of them through the decades of its existence. Israel also agreed to explore negotiations toward a peace treaty with Jordan, as well as separate negotiations on the final status of the West Bank and Gaza, to allow a self-governing Palestinian Authority to form, and to include the Palestinians in negotiations on their own future, in a manner that satisfied both Arab substantive and Israeli procedural requirements. For the Camp David Agreement, Sadat and Begin shared the Nobel Peace Prize of 1978. In his acceptance speech on December 10, 1978, Sadat reiterated his vision of peace. Even this triumph, he said, was but an interim end in a much larger process aimed at security, liberty, and dignity for all the peoples of the region. An ultimate and enduring peace, not yet achieved, would be indivisible and comprehensive. The peace he desired would not just save man from death by destructive weapons but also rid humanity of the evils of want and misery. He concluded, "Peace is a dynamic construction to which all should contribute, each adding a new brick. It goes far beyond a formal agreement or treaty, it transcends a word here or there. That is why it requires politicians who enjoy vision and imagination and who, beyond the present, look toward the future." There was a 6-month gap between the conclusion of the Camp David Accords and the signing of the peace treaty. In the interim, negotiations continued, and Sadat took additional steps to reassure Israel, accepting that Egypt would no longer claim a special role in Gaza and that it would not object to Israel's guarantee from the United States for the loss of oil in the small Sinai oil field. Finally, on March 26, 1979, after approval by the Israeli Knesset and the Egyptian People's Assembly, the peace treaty was signed on the White House lawn. 2 months later, Begin and Sadat met in El Arish for the transfer of that city from Israeli to Egyptian control. They looked on as Egyptian and Israeli soldiers embraced each other and pledged themselves to peace. As Begin remembered the scene in a letter to Sadat, "We have learned to transform the treaty into a living reality of peace, friendship, and cooperation. In stating this I cannot but make mention, with the deepest feeling, that meeting we witnessed together at El Arish between the soldiers, the war invalids of Egypt and Israel who said to each other and to us, 'No more war.' What a unique, moving scene that was. The unraveling. Sadat's invocation of ancient partnership, the brotherhood of Ismail and Isaac, failed to stir the imagination of those on both sides most needed to fulfill it. Just after Egypt and Israel agreed to the Camp David framework, and before they signed the bilateral treaty normalizing diplomatic relations, it became clear that Israel would resume building settlements in the West Bank and Gaza as soon as the 3-month suspension of construction expired. Sadat wrote to Begin in late November 1978, asking for a timetable for transferring authority to the inhabitants of West Bank and Gaza. Begin responded with a list of Egypt's failures to live up to its own commitments. Begin interpreted the language of the peace treaty as not requiring the Israel Defense Forces to withdraw from the West Bank or Gaza, and that the Palestinians had been granted the status not of a political entity but rather of an administrative council. On July 30, 1980, the Knesset once again proclaimed Jerusalem to be Israel's capital. Sadat protested, proposing instead a unified administration but divided sovereignty over Jerusalem. Begin replied that the city was indivisible. In a letter received by Begin on August 15, 1980, Sadat wrote that under such circumstances it would be impossible to resume negotiations. While Israel challenged particular provisions, the Arab world opposed the entire agenda of the Camp David Accords. Arab states saw the peace treaty as a violation of the 1950 Arab League Agreement on Joint Defense and Economic Cooperation, which prohibited any member from entering into a separate peace with Israel. Prominent Arab leaders repudiated the Camp David Accords for failing to settle the final status of the West Bank and Gaza, and for not including the PLO in negotiations. King Hussein of Jordan vehemently denounced the treaty and described himself as absolutely shattered by Sadat's actions. On March 31, 1979, the Arab League suspended Egypt from membership and resolved to move its headquarters from Cairo to Tunis. In December 1979, the UN General Assembly voted 102 to 37 to condemn the accords and other partial settlements on the grounds that they neglected Palestinian rights. Almost all of the Arab League members who had not already severed diplomatic relations with Egypt promptly did so. External Arab opposition fueled existing hostility to Sadat within Egypt. After the 1973 war, he had gained the political legitimacy to shed Nasser's legacy by dint of crossing the Suez Canal. In the spring of 1974, he introduced his signature domestic legislation, the Infita, or Open Door, policy that liberalized Egypt's economy. The Infita was intended to spur foreign aid and investment and bring about an economic boom. Aid did arrive. From 1973 to 1975, Arab states gave Egypt more than $4 billion. And American economic assistance would also multiply, reaching $1 billion annually by 1977. That figure, approaching quantitative parity with American aid to Israel, was greater than U.S. aid to all of Latin America and the rest of Africa combined. But, although Egypt's GDP growth rate accelerated, from 1.5% in 1974 to 7.4% in 1981, the anticipated boom in investment and productivity never followed. Egypt failed to develop indigenous capital. Short-term loans bore interest rates of up to 20%, and 90% of the funds used in public projects came from outside Egypt. In January 1977, when Sadat tried to roll back subsidies on staple foods like bread, riots broke out across the country, with demonstrations of 30,000 people in Cairo alone. Sadat's economic policies also created a visible class of well-to-do foreigners. Militant Islamic groups, composed largely of members of the middle or lower middle class, took to overt protest and opposition. Some of his staunchest antagonists were Muslim brothers whom Sadat had released from prison without realizing the degree to which many of them had become his enemies while incarcerated. The two most powerful Islamic militant groups at the time, Repentance and Holy Flight, Al-Takfir w al-Hijra, and the Islamic Liberation Organization, Munazamat al-Tahrir al-Islami, both of which were dedicated to fighting Western influence and Zionism, also opposed Sadat's peace efforts, interpreting his November 1977 Knesset speech, in which he described Israel as an established fact, as recognition of the Israeli state and thus a contravention of Islamist doctrine. His proposal to build a church, mosque and synagogue on Mount Sinai, which had been made public in the summer of 1978, was denounced as blasphemous. The fundamentalists were passionately opposed also to Sadat's legislative efforts promoting women's rights, dubbed Jahan's laws after his young, half-English wife who advocated birth control and the liberalizing of divorce laws. Opposition turned to violence. In July 1977, a fundamentalist group kidnapped and executed one of Sadat's former ministers. In response, Sadat passed legislation ordering a death sentence for anyone belonging to a secret armed organization. Jahan Sadat, then studying for a master's degree, became alarmed for her husband's safety. As she would recall in her memoirs, "I wondered whether Anwar knew how deeply they were against him. My husband had advisors and intelligence reports, but I had more access to the people. Anwar occasionally visited the universities, but I saw the fundamentalists with my own eyes every day. And unlike some advisors, I was not afraid to pass on an unfavorable report. Fundamentalism is growing, Anwar, I cautioned him during the fall of '79. If you do not act soon, they may gain the political strength to overthrow everything you stand for. Tensions in Egypt worsened after the formal conclusion of peace. In 1979, the Arab League declared the end of its economic aid as well as of private bank loans and oil exports to Egypt. The Iranian Revolution pitted Sadat against the Islamists celebrating the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini. Sadat and the Shah had formed a personal friendship while the former was still vice president, and the latter had extended financial assistance after the 1973 war and oil supplies during a shortage. In 1974, he remained Sadat's supporter after the trip to Jerusalem. In 1980, Sadat would welcome the exiled Shah to Egypt when his refuge in Panama was threatened by Iranian requests for his extradition. Sadat's domestic challenges were compounded by the disquiet among the 1952 revolutionaries, who had since governed on the basis of the army's prestige and of Nasser's ability to evoke mass passions. Although Sadat undertook some political reforms, nominally replacing the single-party system with multi-party elections in 1976 and using referenda to circumvent the National Assembly, he had not fundamentally altered the constitution of the Free Officers' Government, which enshrined authoritarian rule, and he had also maintained the dominance of the military elite. Sensing the growth in opposition, Sadat, out on a limb, followed his usual tactic of dealing with opponents by confronting them head-on. He clamped down on free speech, dissolved student unions and banned vectors of religious extremism. In the process, Sadat shrank the group of those around him, finding himself in a classic dilemma. The deeper his conflict with the ideological majority, and the shallower his support, the more precarious his situation became. In September 1981, after a summer of Muslim, Coptic violence, Sadat carried out mass arrests, imprisoning more than 1,500 activists. He even detained both the Coptic Pope and the Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood. The steady growth of religious extremism posed a central paradox for Sadat's domestic program. As one contemporary observer put it, the more liberal and democratic Sadat wants to be in order to carry out his dream, the more attentive and responsive he must become to popular demands to revert to the tradition of Islam. His pursuit of the dream of reconciliation turned into a choice for martyrdom. Assassination. As a young boy, Sadat had admired the efforts of Egyptian patriots to fight for independence. He cherished one legend in particular, that of Zahran, a young Egyptian sentenced to hanging by the British. While others shuffled meekly to their fates, Zahran walked to the scaffold with his head held high, proclaiming in defiance, "I am dying to free Egypt." Sadat's daughter Camelia wrote that, all his life, her father had modeled his conduct on Zahran's example. On October 6, 1981, Egypt celebrated the 8th anniversary of the October War. Sadat was sitting on a reviewing stand at a military parade when suddenly one of the trucks slowed to a halt. A group of soldiers, fundamentalists within the Egyptian military, including an Islamic Jihad member who had escaped arrest in the earlier crackdown, started firing on Sadat. They killed the president and 10 others. Sadat had believed that Egypt's freedom would be achieved first through independence and then through historic reconciliation. His aim was to resurrect an ancient dialogue between Jews and Arabs, based on his understanding that their histories were meant to intertwine. It was precisely this belief in the compatibility and coexistence of societies founded on different religious faiths that his opponents found intolerable. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Prime Minister Begin praised Sadat's visit to Jerusalem and declared that he had been murdered by the enemies of peace, adding, "His decision to come to Jerusalem and the reception accorded to him by the people, the Knesset, and the government of Israel will be remembered as one of the great events of our time." President Sadat did not pay attention to abuse and hostility, and went ahead with endeavors to abolish the state of war with Israel and to make peace with our nation. It was a difficult road. Sadat's funeral was held on October 10. President Reagan, having himself just survived an assassination attempt, could not attend. In his stead, and as a symbol of America's respect, he sent Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Carter, along with Secretary of State Alexander Haig, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, and UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick. As a special courtesy, he attached me, then in private life, to the delegation. The funeral was a strange affair, tightly managed by security forces, with a sense of shock still hanging in the air. The streets were quiet. There was none of the public outpouring of grief that had accompanied Nasser's funeral. The identity of the group responsible for his murder had not yet been clarified, but it was obvious that there had been high-level collusion, at least within the military. This meant the prominent guests at the funeral procession, among them the three American presidents, Begin, Lee Kuan Yew, the Prince of Wales, former British Prime Minister James Callaghan, British Foreign Secretary Lord Carrington, French President François Mitterrand and former President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, and European Parliament President Simone Veil, had to be protected as if potential targets. Just 2 days earlier, insurgents had attempted to overrun a regional security headquarters to the south of Cairo. The Libyan government, rejoicing at President Sadat's death, was spreading false reports of more violence in Egypt. When several hundred mourners tried to merge into the procession, guards fired shots in the air to keep them out. The 100 or so VIP guests had been assembled in a tent on the grounds of the parade route where Sadat was murdered. After a wait of well over an hour, we walked behind Sadat's coffin along the same route as the military parade 4 days earlier, passing the place of his assassination on our way to bury him. The eeriness of the funeral echoed the unsettled prospects of the Middle East. Sadat's conduct had reflected his confidence that his counterparts might choose his path. His death symbolized the penalty they might have to pay. As radical regimes, exemplified by Gaddafi's reign of political violence, which sponsored terrorism from Scotland to Berlin, overwhelmed parts of the Arab world, those who stood for moderation were thrown into jeopardy. As I said on the night of his death, Sadat had taken from our shoulders the burdens of many difficult uncertainties, burdens that others would now have to assume. Sadat's epitaph contains a verse from the Quran: "Do not consider those killed for the sake of Allah dead but alive and blessed by the side of the Almighty." Below that, it reads, "Hero of war and peace." He lived for the sake of peace and was martyred for the sake of his principles. On the occasion of a visit to Egypt in April 1983, I paid my respects at Sadat's tomb. I was the only mourner present. Epilogue: The Unrealized Legacy. Anwar Sadat is best known for the peace treaty with Israel that he brought to Egypt. His ultimate design, however, was not a peace treaty, great though that achievement was, but a historic modification in Egypt's pattern of being and a new order in the Middle East as a contribution to the peace of the world. From his youth, he recognized that Egypt, as a result of its history, was no more suited to being a subjugated province than it was to being the ideological leader of the Arab world. Its strength lay in its aspiration to an eternal identity. Egypt's geographical location between the Arab world and the Mediterranean was both a potential asset and a liability. Sadat envisioned Egypt as a peaceful Islamic nation, strong enough to partner with its erstwhile enemy rather than either dominating it or being dominated by it. He understood that a just peace could be achieved only through an organic evolution and the recognition of mutual interests, not from imposition by outside powers. And the culmination of that process would be a universal acceptance of such principles. Sadat's overall vision was too out of joint with that of his colleagues and contemporaries to be sustained. What survived him were the practical elements that he considered ephemeral. The crucial contest in the modern Middle East is still with us. It is a competition between advocates of a religiously or ideologically pluralistic order, who treat their personal and communal convictions as compatible with a state-based system, and Sadat's repudiators, engaged in the articulation of a comprehensive theology or ideology across every domain of life. As imperial ambitions threaten to swallow states whole, and insurgencies divide them from within, Sadat's vision of international order among sovereign states, based on national interests defined in moral terms, could be a bulwark against calamity. In an address delivered in May 1979 at Ben-Gurion University, where he was receiving an honorary degree, Sadat called for a revival of the spirit of relative tolerance of Islam's medieval golden age. He added, "The challenge before us is not one of scoring a point here or there, rather, it is how to build a viable structure for peace for your generation and for the generations to come." Fanaticism and self-righteousness are no answer to the complex problems of today. The answer is tolerance, compassion, and magnanimity. We will be judged not by the hard positions we took but by the wounds we heal, the souls we saved, and the suffering we eliminated. One of Sadat's primary aims was to demonstrate Egypt's inherent independence. At a private dinner after our official relationship had ended, I remarked that the Americans he had worked with owed him a debt of gratitude for making us look better than we were. With some emphasis, Sadat replied that his work had not been done for the sake of his or anyone's reputation. He had embarked on his mission to restore the dignity and hope of the Egyptian people and set standards for peace in the world. As he said at the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty signing ceremony in March 1979, "Let there be no more wars or bloodshed between Arabs and Israelis. Let there be no more suffering or denial of rights. Let there be no more despair or loss of faith. Let no mother lament the loss of her child. Let no young man waste his life on a conflict from which no one benefits. Let us work together until the day comes when they beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And God does call to the abode of peace. He does guide whom he pleases to his way." Yet Sadat did not merely express his civilization, he modified and ennobled it. Much as he revered the epic past, his signal accomplishment was to transcend the pattern of Egypt's recent history. In the same way, as a prisoner, he had transcended confinement by opening himself to moral and philosophical change. As he reflected on those years in his memoirs, "Inside Cell 54, as my material needs grew increasingly less, the ties which had bound me to the natural world began to be severed, one after another. My soul, having jettisoned its earthly freight, was freed and took off like a bird soaring into space, into the furthest regions of existence, into infinity. My narrow self ceased to exist and the only recognizable entity was the totality of existence, which aspired to a higher, transcendental reality." In this spirit, later in life, he bridged the gaps between Egyptian and Israeli perceptions and the initial incommensurabilities of their negotiating positions. He understood that a zero-sum mindset would only freeze in place a status quo as antithetical to the Egyptian national interest, as it was to the cause of peace. He then had the extraordinary courage to realize that revolution. In this effort, he had important Israeli partners. Israel's geography did not lend itself to heroic gestures. Yet the Israeli leaders who partnered with Sadat, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin and Menachem Begin, were moved by his vision of peace. 222, Rabin in particular articulated a notion of peace parallel to Sadat's. On the occasion of the Jordanian peace agreement in 1994, he said to the American Congress, "In the Bible, our book of books, peace is mentioned, in its various idioms, 237 times. In the Bible, from which we draw our values and our strength, in the book of Jeremiah, we find a lamentation for Rachel the matriarch. It reads, 'Refrain your voice from weeping, and your eyes from tears, for their work shall be rewarded, says the Lord. I will not refrain from weeping for those who are gone.' But on this summer day in Washington, far from home, we sense that our work will be rewarded, as the prophet foretold." Both Rabin and Sadat were struck down by assassins hostile to the changes that peace might bring. Shortly after Sadat's assassination, I wrote that it was too early to judge whether he had started an irreversible movement of history, or had consigned himself to the fate of the ancient pharaoh Akhenaten, who dreamed of monotheism amidst the panoply of Egyptian deities a millennium before it was accepted among mankind. 40 years later, the long-lived Egypt-Israel peace agreement, the parallel Israeli agreement with Jordan, even the Syrian disengagement agreement and most recently the Abraham Accords, a series of diplomatic normalizations between Israel and Arab nations signed in the summer and fall of 2020, stand as Sadat's vindication. What is more, even where formal agreements have yet to be concluded, time has worn away some of the sands of illusion to expose the harder rock of Sadat's truth. Early in our acquaintance, I sometimes wondered whether Sadat might have been playing a longer game than he was given time to finish. Once he had fulfilled his immediate purposes, might he have returned to earlier convictions, or reached for a different, even more sweeping perception? The only version of Sadat that I can speak to with confidence is the one I knew. We spent hours together on the various negotiations described in this chapter, and many evenings for the rest of his life in more abstract but equally edifying conversation as friends. The Sadat with whom I was familiar had moved from a strategic to a prophetic vision. The Egyptian people asked no more of him than the return to the pre-war borders. What he gave them, starting with his speech to the Knesset, was a vision of universal peace, which I believe was his definitive incarnation and the culmination of his convictions. Our last conversation took place in August 1981 on a flight from Washington to New York, after his first meeting with President Reagan. He had by then encountered 4 American presidents in 7 years, each with a modified program. He was visibly tired. But suddenly he turned to me and spoke about a cherished symbolic project. "Next March, the Sinai will come back to us," he said. "There will be a great celebration. You helped take the first step, and you should come celebrate with us." Then there was one of his long and pensive pauses as empathy overtook exuberance. "No, you shouldn't," he continued. "It will be very painful for the Israelis to give up this territory. It would hurt the Jewish people too much to see you in Cairo celebrating with us. You should come a month later. Then you and I can drive alone to Mount Sinai, where I intend to build a synagogue, a mosque, and a church. This will be a better commemoration." Sadat was assassinated at a parade to celebrate the watershed event which he had initiated. and which had transformed the Middle East. He did not live to witness the return of the Sinai from Israel which he had brought about. The houses of worship on Mount Sinai that he envisioned are not yet being built. His vision of peace is still waiting for its incarnation. But Sadat was both patient and serene. His perspective was that of ancient Egypt, which treated fulfillment as the unfurling of eternity.